the next breakthrough in terms of how a team can level up their game is through data analytics. I think with this type of, forefrontiering, that a team can actually get way better than the competition currently in its current day and age, because I think ultimately an analyst's job at the current moment is very limited because of the lack of analytics itself, or rather useful analytics, and through that data aggregation itself, which is just another form of analytics, or rather it's the precursor in order to then use analytics in and of itself. And so I think if you look at any of the large companies within the current day and age that exist, you think of fucking Google, right? You think of Facebook, Reddit, Amazon, all these players within, the global sphere. A lot of them, part of their main business is data aggregation and to be able to sell that data to other people. And so if you're able to do this within the esports sense, you're going to become a fucking juggernaut, first of all, but second of all, is that you're going to be very useful to esports teams. So we're talking about good data analytic points like jungle proximity, for certain lanes or certain players and whatnot, which the LCS already has. But I think it's one of the coolest statistics that is actually useful that you can use in terms of what team favors what side for the most part, maybe what matchup that happened, or what counter pick that happened to where the jungle proximity got affected as such. And so then you could use that data in order to better determine exactly how a team is going to play or their play style in general, to where then you can go into the match a little bit more knowledgeable about how to beat this other team. Champions played in scrims. You can keep track of how many times you've played against a particular team or whatnot, and the actual champions that they're playing against you, or what they think are counter picks, or what your own players have picked within your own scrims and whatnot, rather than just manually entering them in. You could have a script or a program that's running on your computer that can log all of this data. You think of maybe heat maps of wards that is largely time-based, on the entire vision game throughout the entirety of a game or a scrim match. That would be incredibly useful in terms of determining where the enemy team is going to place their awards at any given moment, especially, in the early game openings or whatnot. They tend to do this or they tend to do that. You could even do counter pick percentage for certain players, both for your own players and for the enemy team. How many times do they counterpick? How many times do you counterpick, for your mid laner or for your bot laner? Pick order percentage. Based on what role, who do you pick for in that essence, right? Based upon your own team or based upon the enemy's team, and also to see maybe how that meta is shifting in between regions and whatnot. And we'll get to that idea in a second of getting data aggregation across multiple regions. I think the large part of why data aggregation is so important within team organizations, at least currently, is because it's seemingly that players don't respect a lot of analysts or a lot of coaches. So if you go in there with hard data and you say, hey, these are the fucking numbers and they don't lie and they're actually good statistical measurements, then you could start to bring some fundamental arguments that they really can't argue, right? And so as long as you aren't abusing the numbers as such, then it'll be a good way in order to inform your team to have them have, marked improvements based upon the data that actually exists of their faults and, their strengths too. And I think this too has been kind of a fault of analysts themselves in the fact that they just don't have enough resources in order to combat this type of stigma from the players themselves. And so this would really help out a lot in terms of the entire argument. I go towards, I had one of this really good interviews, in fact, in the past. I want to say it was 2019. I'll link down the in the description below of this interview that I had with Weldon when he was on CLG. Now, granted, that team's roster construction was one of the worst roster constructions that I've ever seen. But with that said, I think he did some cool things in terms of analytics, and the fact that he brought on this this analytics company called like Mid Game or something. Terrible fucking name. But they would analyze the voice comms of CLG. So essentially, it was probably a program running in the background which would analyze the voice logs, transcribe it into, written words, and then determine that and determine how much a player is talking, how much a player gets interrupted, which player gets interrupted most often. And so he would be able to use this type of data in order to, determine who's actually vocal, maybe who needs to speak up a little bit more. At what points in the game do they talk or do they not talk? So I thought it was really interesting in how CLG was using this type of like data analytics in order to get an advantage or maybe to shore up some weaknesses. And I can only assume that teams are doing this somewhat, but I don't think maybe all teams are doing this, and also maybe to what degree as to they're using, data analytics or data aggregation. And so this whole thought process kind of spurred me on because in part of my pleb job, I do a whole bunch of different shit for my company, but I also do data aggregation, or rather data integration, in terms of how do I make this system talk to this system and kind of bridge the gap so that they could share data. And largely that is through APIs and whatnot, to where you could transfer data such as maybe like inventory or something from one system over into another, so that you can always have the same amount of inventory within both systems, even though they might be for completely different reasons. And so I think this is very important to be able to have those cross channels of how data is actually integrated within esports and how esports uses data, in fact. And so there is this one famous company. If you're an esports team and you're listening right now, you're obviously going to know what I'm going to be saying as far as this company, which is Shadow.gg, which is run by Tim Sevenhausen. I think I'm saying that right. I've never actually heard him say his own name. But he is the founder of Oracle's Elixir, as you guys might know. And he has started this Shadow.gg. I think he's like the head of analytics over there or something. And their parent company is this company called Baze Esports. And so if you look into just the entire diagram or flow of this company, I'll actually link down their website in the description below as well too, because I thought it was interesting, is that they end up selling the data aggregation that they do to Riot. I think they sell it to the LCS, the LCK, and the LEC. They're partnered with all those three different, team or tournament organizers, if you want to call it that, I guess. But it's all Riot, right? They do MSI as well. They do IEM, over in like Counter-Strike and whatnot. So they do a whole bunch of different tournaments, ESL. And they do data aggregation, and then they are able to give those broadcast teams live stats, and they'll package it in a really neat way and whatnot, so that the broadcast team can draw from that. And so assumingly, this is what Riot uses when you hear about jungle proximity and when you hear about all these different data points or statistics that they're using live on broadcast that oftentimes teams don't have. And it's probably because this company is drawing from that tournament realm server and getting data points which other teams can't get because they don't have access to the API of that server, that tournament realm. So I think it's really genius, but They also have a kind of like a package plan to where teams and organizations can access part of their API in order to get some of this data so that it can help their team improve more and grab, data points and whatnot. So I think this is partly how esports revolutionizes itself in terms of how you get ahead of the competition is through this a portion of the space. And you could even see in Counter-Strike Global Offensive is that they've also been trying to up their game in terms of data and data integration within their entire teams or organizations is through a company called Skybox. Now, Skybox was developed by this guy or this caster called Anders Blum. Now, if you guys are fans of Counter-Strike at all, you'll recognize his name immediately. And the fact that he is a well-known analyst within the scene, and, he always has all these fucking crazy ideas and whatnot. But it's very smart because this gives teams data points in order to build strategies or build counter strategies against certain teams and whatnot. And I would assume that every Counter-Strike team that is a top team, I would say like top 20, would have to subscribe to this because it's such a good fucking tool. It gives you like a sky view, which is, hence the name Skybox, because, they're reaching the upper limits of the ceiling. But it's a top-down view oftentimes, and you could see plays run throughout the course of a demo, and you could see all the characters move on the map, smokes being dropped in certain areas or flashbangs, and you can see the tendencies that maybe a certain player has or a certain team has. And so this changes the game entirely, and I can envision this for League of Legends itself in terms of getting data aggregation in order to understand your opponents better or the tendencies. And now, granted, I think the biggest thing that this is going to help with is that, first of all, as an analyst, you can't watch all the fucking regions, let alone all the major regions, right? Because, China has like a fucking billion games, and then you got to do LCK, and then, like, who has time for LCS or LEC, right? And then after that, especially, you are not going to be able to watch all the games in all the minor regions and stuff. But with that said, AI can watch those games and can get API data, or rather, maybe if you have machine learning through visual processing, you could develop an AI program to where all it does is just watch YouTube videos all day of the games themselves in terms of the professional matches, and then you could derive data from that. Now, that's a little outlandish because it would take a lot of memory in order to do that, and server storage and all that shit. But that's probably the future that we're looking at in terms of data aggregation. And even ProView, you could also get further into that to actually see the nuances of maybe how a particular plays, what wards does he place here or there. It would just be insanely fucking crazy how deep you could get in terms of analytics just within the current day and age of League of Legends itself. So I think this is the new frontier in terms of how teams improve over the competition, at least like from a small incremental level. This will give you that slight edge in order to, I guess, understand your opponent and whatnot. And I just thought it's incredibly interesting. There's a lot of these companies that people don't seemingly know about, fans don't know about, like Shadow.gg, which is an apt name, in fact. And it's these companies that I think are behind the scenes that are actually going to push the edge towards innovation and towards teams getting better and whatnot. And I just think it's a fascinating time for the analytics scene, just as a broad sweeping brush, as it were.